Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to see you today to talk about gender and criminal violence in Cultic groups, experience of former members. I'm here today with Céleste Goguen, who is a
Hello.
student, a master's degree student at University de Moncton. Most of the results that we will show you today are the result of our master thesis. So it's with great pleasure that we will be presenting you those results. I'm Marie-Andrée Pelland. I'm a professor of criminology, and I'm also a president of the conseil d'administration, the board of director of Info-Secte. Sorry.
It's all right.
Um, so today, the goal of our presentation is to understand how gender role and definitions within culture groups influence the experience of violence, drawing on testimonies of former members from patriarchal communities. Celeste met with a lot of group members, various of groups, but they all have in common that the authority within those groups are detained by men members.
Mhm.
We will introduce key theoretical concepts to understand the experience of former members. And after that, we will highlight their definition of gender. We will identify the continuum of gender-based violence experienced by the members. We will also analyze the individual or structure that use violence as a means of controlling members. And we will recognize, if it's the case, the impact of such violence on those who are affected, the former member that we have met.
So, what is a cult? I'm sure you've heard about that. I'm sure you've asked yourselves many, many times what that is. And to tell you the truth, there's not one answer, to be quite honest with you. But with this research, we've come with a lot of different definitions that have encompassed many similarities. So, what we've done for our definition is combine them in three parts. So, we'll look at the components of what the leadership or an authority figure looks like in a cult. We'll look at what are the strategies of control, if you will, or control strategies, whatever you prefer, in turn in a cultic group, and how does a group function in a cultic group, because all of those have very specific points to them that make a cult a cult. So when we talk about leadership, definitions kind of vary towards what a leader, an authoritarian figure kind of looks like. Banisadio will say that a leader often has a childlike ego, so you can figure out it's like an adult child, if you will, sometimes. Ziders and Devlin will say that the leader has a malignant narcissism to them. Might say him. I'm sorry, it's not necessarily all men, but
Almost,
um,
almost.
all most. Let's go with most. But what we're really looking at is there a difference between what a charismatic leader looks like. So Dirk Bohr and Weber will give us two kind of variations towards that. So we have the prophetic charismatic leadership. So that's kind of what you usually see in cults, if you will, most of the time. So what that means is the leader will sometimes have some extraordinary gift, if you will. He might have some intuition that nobody else has. He might be able to access hidden knowledge that only he has in relations to God or whatever spiritual figure they figure. Uh, he might have healing gifts. And the bond that that person creates becomes so intense and emotional that that's what creates this sort of leadership, this charismatic leadership towards it. That that charisma, if you will, creates this exceptional trust and faith that the individuals essentially put all their faith into this one person versus a functional or bureaucratic charismatic leadership is not necessarily somebody who has these extraordinary gifts. Um, it's really based on legitimacy of the rules or the institutional hierarchy, if you will. So, what do we mean by that? Well, There is a actual process. It's not, oh, this person is different than everybody else, therefore he is the leader. It's this person has the capabilities, the abilities, if you will, because this is what we're looking for in a leader. So when we talk about charisma, like the PowerPoint kind of points out, charisma is linked to the role rather than the individual.
Yeah. Those kind of leadership will happen maybe a couple of years or 10, 20 years after the prophetic leader is gone.
Mhm.
So how do we give the power to after? So it's someone that has a role. It's not someone that has specific qualities.
Exactly. When we talk about those control strategies, we have Lalish and McLaren who event essentially created this concept called bounded choice. And what that means is how does control essentially get exerted onto people? So Lalish and McLaren will say that the bounded choice theory, if you will, is done with four components towards that individual. So there's a transcendent belief system that follows a person on every single day, if you will, with every single choice they make. That is always, on their shoulder, if you will. They can't necessarily do certain things without having that belief system next to them. There's the charismatic authority, kind of like we just talked about, this idea that there is a leader that has gifts, that knows better, if you will. So if this person says, I'm able, for example, able to read minds, well, okay, you feel control because you don't want them to read your mind, if you will. There is an actual system of control, as in maybe you could have some cases of isolation, or what you can and cannot do, what you can and cannot say, if you will. There are also the systems of influence. What we mean by that can also sometimes not necessarily just come from the leader. It can come from family members, it can come from other members, it can come from yourself, that essentially influences you into making certain decisions based on everything else. Hassan also created the BITE model, which is very similar in terms of control strategies. So Hassan has divided them really in four different categories. So you have behavior control, everything that has to do with your behavior, whether you're how you're listening, how you're acting, if you will. Uh, Everything that comes in information, what comes into the group, what doesn't come into the group, what gets said out of the group or for the group. That is a control strategy. Thought control as well, same kind of the same idea. What are you thinking versus what can you not think? What are you not allowed to think? And the emotional control, how are you allowed to react to certain things? How are you allowed to expected to react to a situation, a violent situation, a situation where there's confrontation? How are you expected to do that? Also, when it comes to group functioning, cultic groups have a tendency to have a lot of the same characteristics that kind of tend to repeat themselves. We saw that in a lot of different definitions, so we kind of put them all in a little something for you. So there's a lot of it's very common to see a cultic group referred to having a split worldview. So everything is either good or bad, and most of the time, if not all of the time, the good is the group. Everything else is the bad, and especially those who say something negative towards the group, they are viewed as inherently bad. Because of that split worldview, there's also that kind of comes in tandem with the separation between them and us. So if they are good, if the group is good, that means that it's us, and everybody else against the world is bad. So therefore, that kind of falls together. There's a hierarchical structure. What we mean by that is that kind of like a pyramid, if you will, a triangle, whatever you prefer. The very top is the leader or the spiritual, whatever. And then you have the men, which are quasi leaders, if you will. And then at the very bottom always ends up being the women or the children, or if you will. Also, the group functioning is loyalty is a very important case for the group. everything comes to the group. What I mean by that is everything is the most important thing is the group. You can have a good relationship, you can have a good family. That doesn't matter. What comes first is the group. It will always be the group. And because of such loyalty, there's also a lot of times a surveillance system, if you will. Yeah, you could think about literal cameras and stuff like that, but what's a better surveillance system than your group, brothers and sisters, if you will, who know or what is expected of you and what isn't expected of you. So you always have somebody essentially watching over you.
In the last couple of years, the definition spiritual abuse is a theoretical concept that came in to better understand the control that could happen in a religious organization. And I think the work of Rutkowski helped us to understand a new way to understand different various forms of control within a cultic group. One is the performance-based acceptance. What does that mean? It is that each of the members will be accepted, recognized within the group only if they respect the norm imposed within the group. If you go against the norm, you will be punished and you can be isolated and you can be exposed. So you have to respect the model transmitted by the group if you want to be recognized, to have a status within the group.
For sure.
The other point that is also important is that it's required to obey the abuser.
Yes.
So usually within the group, there's a culture where we will say that you must respect the leader, you must respect the other man or each person that had that power. So even if they use violence against you, if they use sexual violence, you cannot report them.
Yes.
Because they have power within the group and they have the power to ask you those things. So that's the reason why sometimes it's only when you come out of the group that you see those behavior as abuse. But when you were within, you saw it as a normal way to do things.
Exactly.
Because it's the victim week of criminal act, what kind of crime is committed within a cultic group? When we look at the court report or institutional report, we see that in cultic group, members were accused of sexual violence, physical harassment, physical violence. We have some cases of murder or attempted murder. Some cases of refusal of medical treatment, illegal practice of medicine, or criminal negligence. We have some cases of trafficking, of illegal substance, or even consummation of illegal substance, fraud, financial exploitation, or confrontation with public officials, such as confronting the police with an arm, for example. When we look at those accusations, those reports, they always talk about the control that the member will experience within the group, but we see no accusation from those kind of abuse. We don't see accusation of manipulation, coercive control. We only see accusation of extreme behavior committed within the cultic group. What we don't see too much mention within those accusations, it's the gender abuse.
Absolutely.
So that's why we think that it's important to talk about it today. Belknap talk about gender-based abuse, and what she said it about, it's important to understand gender-based abuse to distinguish between two notions, sex and gender. So usually sex refers to biological differences such as reproductive organ, body structure, muscle development, or hormones. And gender will mostly refer to socially construct role and expectation within a group. Those include norms related to clothing, wage, caregiving, or professional role, what kind of career a person can have. And often it's rooted in social inequality. So some gender will have more power than other.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's why we can see it on a continuum. At one extreme is men, another extreme is female, but we can position ourselves everywhere on that continuum. But what we have to understand is within a cultic organization, sex and gender are similar.
Yes.
So your biology will determine your gender role.
Absolutely.
And we don't have diversity of gender in most of the cultic organization. So you are either a man or a woman.
Yeah.
There's no ambiguity in your sex or your gender. And Tom Alain, who work in spiritual abuse and gender-based abuse, will say that. She said that in cultic organization or religious organization, often the definition of gender will be binary and heteronormative. So the assigned sex, the gender identity, the gender expression, and the attraction will be defined in the same way, it will be synonymous. So men will be attracted by women and women by men. And men will have specific gender role and women will have specific gender role based on their body, what their body can do. Belknap used the notion of gender-based abuse because she says that almost all form of violence will be abused, but it's not all form of abuse that will be violent. So that's why she used the notion of gender-based abuse, so we can put much more behavior in that when we study that information. What she is also saying is that in all society, we will see gender-based abuse. Gender-based abuse aims to control or punish non-conformity with traditional gender. So when you are not similar to what we preach in a group, you will be punished, that's for sure.
Yep.
There are various forms of gender-based abuse, sexual violence, that could be harassment, touching and sexual assault, sexual coercion, or even revenge through pornography, for example. We haven't observed those kind of abuse as of yet, but that could also be sexual and reproductive violence, abortion, forced or coerced sterilization, forced pregnancy or childbirth. It can be attack or physical to the physical integrity. Donc, we can an attack on female genital, honor killing, infanticide of girls, neglect of girls, forced prostitution, forced marriage, or pornography. We can also see violence against LGBTQ plus people. We can observe hostility or insensitivity links to gender identity of expression. We can see even hate crime motivated by homophobia or transphobia. And we can also see elder abuse, street, financial exploitation, or even sexual violence. What is the goal of gender-based abuse? Is restricting the place of women and girl in a society, limiting their freedom and sometimes reducing their quality of life. In fact, we want to keep women under the control of men, increase the power of the aggressor while weakening the power of the survivors.
Absolutely.
How can we think about cultic community that use gender role that could be abusive? We have to think about it in a patriarchal community.
Right.
A cult, a patriarchal community where we can observe a philosophy that promote naturalizing vision of gender, social control of gender, where we can see sometimes purity culture, where we can see empathy, sexism, and misogyny. So that creates a group where gender-based abuse will be, it will be easier to see it in those kind of environment.
Absolutely.
What is a purity culture? It's a culture where virginity and sexual conformity has great value, where purity is attractive, where purity helps us in some cases to conceal or justify sexual abuse. A patriarchal community, a cultic group that from a patriarchal community will use sexism. How? As a justification. So we have to read about the dogma or the philosophy that is transmitted within the group to discover how we justify the power that men have and that women don't have. There's also misogyny that must be understood primarily as law enforcement branch of patriarchal order. That's all the rules that the group put together to better control women and girls, or all of the people who don't conform to the gender norms. So your role, if you want to understand how your group put that together, you must go to what are the justification and form of controls used to impose gender norm.
Absolutely.
Usually, Kate Nan will tell us that a culture that uses misogyny will have female-coded good and male-coded privilege and power. What is female goods and services? Women will provide attention, affection, admiration, sympathy, sex, and will provide children and care for them. Men will have the privilege of power, prestige, public recognition, rank, reputation, honor. He will have money, maybe associated with those positions, and that will give him the privilege to have access to the goods and services provided by women.
Exactly.
But women cannot go and say, I will acquire men-coded property. Yeah. She cannot be dominant in those kind of culture. She must give her good without asking for anything.
So when it comes to our research, what did we decide to use? Well, we decided to use a qualitative methodology. So what does that look like? Well, we're looking with narrative interviews. So what does narrative interviews why did we choose that, if you will? So it's important to see that narrative interviews are not simply just something for the participant to retell their story. Yes, that is part of it. There's no denying that, but that's not the most important part, if you will. It provides a way to either interpret or reinterpret, if you will, certain things about their experience. And with this study, we really looked at the entirety of their life, what made their decision to do this or that, or vice versa. And with a narrative interview, it also allows the person kind of to find their voice and give them a reason to be able to speak and talk about their story. So for some, it's kind of a come to terms for their past, and it kind of allows them to understand while explaining what happened to them for some cases. And in this case, we were really interested in seeing also how does sexual violence, if you will, or gender-based violence, how did that kind of get constructed within the time when they were in the cult, or did it kind of gravitate after the cult as well? And what was their gender role, or how was important the gender role in their narrative, in their stories? That's part of it for us. So what did we end up collecting. We ended up getting 21 narrative interviews with Canadians who were members of cultic groups, 13 of which were either born and or raised within the community. So, anything varying from joining quote unquote at the age of 2 to somewhere to 12, 15, where it's not necessarily still their choice. They just essentially follow what their parents are doing. Versus we have 8 people who joined as an adult. As a result, we had 15 participants who identified themselves as female, 15 of which identified themselves as male. And as of their interview, one person identified themselves as non binary during their interview. So, what were the results, which is the fun part? um, so, when we talk about naturalization of gender roles, so what does that really look like? Well, kind of like Marie-Andrée talked about early on, um, there's not necessarily a continuum with gender as Marie-Andrée referred to. And that kind of follows suit with a lot of the examples we saw where the female is doing quote unquote feminine things and the man is simply doing masculine things. And Daphne really put that really well for us um, when she says complementary means that men were made for one thing and women were made for another. And each of us has our own place in society, in the natural order of life. Women are made to have children and take care of people, and men are made to chop wood. So, right there, she could have used any other example, but it rests ashore. It kind of points out the fact that men have to do the manly thing, if you will, the hard work, not, let's be honest, we're not saying that the women aren't doing hard work either. That's not that. But in terms of the cult, that's what it is. The female is expected to stay at home, look after the children, look after the man, make sure dinner is made when the man is home, when he's done from work. That's the whole naturalization. When we talk about what a man is like in a patriarchal culture group, we also have many common components that kind of came about in the research. With the participants we had, we noticed that men were always able to assert themselves at all time. Assertiveness is viewed as a good thing only in the eyes of a man. If a woman is assertive, that's not a good thing. But assertive as a man, it means you are very manly, if you will. It's also expected for them to impose control and inflict, if you will, obedience on women. So most of the time, that is, we've seen in a lot of the participants that involves physical violence, but that can be used also in verbal violence if maybe. And also, the idea of a man has to be that they are masculine. Um, Kind of like Marie-Andrée pointed out in the theory, a man has to be muscular, well built, if you will. That means he's manly enough. But what is interesting is there's also a difference between control and impulsivity. What do we mean by that? They are expected to impose control on the women, but they are allowed to be impulsive as men. That control, meaning that control does not necessarily follow them. They are allowed to be different. So, what does the impulsivity look like in a man? Well, sometimes that can simply be based on their behavior. They don't necessarily need to be in control of their behavior. So, they can kind of, lash out, if you will, explode. That can happen. That's impulsive. They're allowed to do that. That's okay. Their sexual desires are also impulsive. It's never a man's fault. We'll see that further on. I don't want to give any punches away, if you will, but sexual desires for men are viewed as impulsive and natural, if you will. And if you act on it, well, that's impulse, but it's natural and it's okay. And as a man, anger also is also very common, if you will. And that impulsivity when it comes to anger is also very common. So if a person gets upset, well, it's not simply just I'm going to go sulk in a bedroom, I'm going to lash out or explode, if you will. So when it comes to that ability of control, we have a couple of participants who really explain that very well, especially in The Eye of a Man. Except for Ellen, well, she talks very much about her father, which is a very good point. So here we go. Ellen says, when I was about 10, my father became physically violent towards me because the leader would say to my father, you can't let your daughter talk to you like that. So, right there, we can see the leader is pushing that idea that you have to assure that your daughter, obviously female, is controlled. She has to be able to obey. That is your role as a man, to make sure she obeys. And if you do not, you have to use whatever measure you can. And for him, for Hélène, it was with physical violence. For Olivier, he said, I grew so much as a person. I felt like I became a man out there. I became assertive. So that's what we meant by the idea of being a man comes with being assertive. If you can, it's not necessarily you can't be man without being assertive, but it is kind of expected to you to be assertive, to be that man, that ideological man, if you will, of the group. And Vincent points it out very, very well as well. He says the constant being man enough, having to be tough enough, they go together, they complement one another. You have to be a man, you have to be man enough, but you also have to be tough enough. So once again, this whole idea that gender and sex for them are kind of together. So a man is muscular, well built, tough enough. He does the tough things. So that's why he has to be man enough. The inability to control themselves, especially when it comes to violence, is very prevalent. And we also saw that with Mako, as he said, it's as if my anger had to be asserted there. I took it in, I took it in. And then it would explode inside my family when we got together as a small family in our home where we live. That's what happened. I took it internally, and then when it got to the family, that's when it came out in the form of violence against my wife and son. See, not only does it assert itself, as we talked about just previously, but it's this idea that it builds, it builds, it builds, and the only way to escape is through violence. And like he said, he's not able to control it. But as we've seen as well, it's this idea that in a cultic measure, if you will, in a cultic context, that's okay for the man to for that to happen.
And it's also normalized the fact that he can use it within his family.
Exactly. It's
It's not,
okay.
yeah, it's not defined as bad. No, no,
No,
I took it in, and then it exploded inside my family.
yeah,
It doesn't have a bad feeling with it.
exactly. Versus what does it look like being a woman in the patriarchal cultic groups? Well, it's not being assertive, that's for sure. Some of the common components we found was that for being a woman, well, you have to be a housewife. Whether that's, although it is expected to you to have children, but whether you have children or not, you are still expected to be a housewife. You're expected to stay at home and cater to the man, essentially. And that's the whole point of to be submissive to the man. You're not allowed to be assertive. You're not allowed to raise your voice. You're not allowed to, frankly, do much, but to obey and to be submissive to the man, the head of the house, if you will. And while we did talk earlier about how loyalty is important for the woman, there's still a mini hierarchy, if you will, within the family dynamics. The woman is expected to be more loyal to the man of the house, their husband, if you will, or fiance, whatever they will, to other members, whether that's friends, other members of the family, even children. At the end of the day, the man comes first. So a lot of the common components was really essentially being a mother. That was something that was heard about repeatedly within the interviews. So Vincent said, my sister, when she ended up getting married, of course, immediately started having kids. Nothing else to do for a woman. So there, right over there, you can tell that tone of she's not expected to work. She's expected to have children. And especially, essentially, what he says, as soon as they're married. That's what's expected of her. Janik tells us to be a woman in this is to be a mother. You're going to be a homemaker. You're going to be a servant of God. So again, their identity, a woman's identity, is instinctively put into this idea of she has to be a homemaker. She has to be a mother. There's no other way around it. And Raphael points out, my only future was to become a mother. That's all. You learn as a girl that your duty is going to be a mother. I was by the age of 10 or 11, I was already looking after 4, 5 children. I could already cook for them. In the end, you become a parent very quickly. And that's what groups are often taught, that the sooner the woman, if you will, or the girl learns her quote unquote place, she'll learn those gendered activities, if you will, whether that's the kitchen, whether that's cleaning, whether that's taking care of the kids. That's what she's learned in Rafael's example, 10, 11, but there might be other groups where it's younger or a little older, but it's expected for them to be maternal, if you will.
It's the idea that we train her quickly to
Yes,
adopt a role.
absolutely. So, what does submissive mean in terms of groups? Well, again, it's this idea of obeying the woman, excuse me, of obeying the man, not the woman. Apologies, that would be a big no-no. So, Brienne really gives us a concrete example, if you will. So she says, I remember telling my fiance, there's a girl at school. I think she likes me. I think I've got a bit of a crush for her. Um, I told my fiance we weren't married, and then things didn't work out. He said, I don't want you talking to her. You're going to school, you tell her you can't talk to her anymore. And this is the example we put in because Brienne never questioned whether she should or shouldn't tell her fiance. Even if she's not completely married to him yet, she's fiancéed with him. There was never a question of should I tell him, shouldn't I tell him? It was immediately, oh, I think she has a crush on me. I have to tell my husband or my soon to be husband what will come of that. So rather than us who aren't in cult or anything like that would be questioning that for ourselves, Brielle doesn't put that on her shoulders. She tells him. Also, like everything else, there are also gendered activities because everything's gendered. Let's be honest, everything's gendered in cults. Things that we not necessarily would think are gendered are also often viewed um, as having a bit of a gendered tendency. Daphne really puts it really well. She says, like typically feminine, it's very enforced, even with the kids. Even in the choice of activities we could do, it was like, girls, you're going to learn to comb your hair. Now, not necessarily saying that men won't learn how to comb their hair, but it's inherently a gendered activity. It's designed, quote unquote, towards females, how to comb your hair, how to maybe make a braid, things like that. That is feminine in nature. And if you were interested in doing things more masculine, you would not be allowed. What we did find kind of in that same realm when talking about work, um, our interviews really, interestingly enough, the women very much did not talk about work when they were in the group, when they were talking to us in terms of interviews and things like that. But men, all the men we had would talk about whatever role, whatever job they had in the group when they were in the group. It was really interesting to note that instead, the women would only really talk about their careers or their jobs once they had left the group, as opposed to, talking about that having a job, if you will, in the group. For many of them, it wasn't even, they didn't have what you call a quote unquote regular job. So, what does that mean also in terms of that loyalty towards men we mentioned a little bit earlier? Well, what happens is that in some of our cases, we had people who had been born in the group or had joined, quote unquote, very young. And that affected essentially their parental authority, well, their experience towards parental authority, if you will. So what do we mean by that? Well, Brielle really says it nicely. She says, then several years later, I had a conversation with my mother, and she confessed to me that she knew there was something about that man that wasn't right, and that he was violent. That hurt because I thought, why did you push me into this? So her mother wasn't able to tell her, to warn her, to say, Brienne, maybe, we shouldn't put you in this situation. That was as a usual, quote unquote, mother figure, you would kind of expect a mother to speak up on such a thing. But in this case, she wasn't because of the loyalty to the men, to her husband, to the group, if you will. Camille even puts it as well. Camille was a victim of incest, so that's why we kind of started that off. She says, I had to get out of there. Then my mother, she had to choose between her husband and her daughter. And in any case, I got up and said, you don't have to choose. I'm the one who's going to leave. So with Camille's case, she kind of has to step up as her own mother, essentially, and make the decision for her, rather than her mother shielding her or choosing her daughter over her husband. She doesn't choose, period. So Camille has to step up and make that decision for her. When it comes to the control over the human body, that's also very common. It's something we notice that is said by females and not by men, and that's not for nothing. That kind of tends with the purity culture of things. Daphne really put it well when she says, when I was 13, I couldn't go out after 5 p.m. I couldn't dye my hair. I couldn't draw on myself. I was punished for weeks because my body is God's temple. So just this idea that you can't even write a pen, something on your body, on your arm with a pen, and you'd be punished. It's this inherent control over everything. Your body's not even your own body. It belongs to the group, if you will.
Right.
Isabel says, no shoulders, no butt, no like exposed areas. And the tank top I was wearing was not a spaghetti strap. So then clothing became an issue. So I had to be like fully clothed. So again, this issue that they have to wear clothes at all times. They're essentially suffocated, if you will, by their clothes. They don't even have that autonomy to decide what they can or can't wear. When it comes to marriage, marriage kind of becomes an obligation, if you will, for men and women, for different reasons. Um, a lot of the times, marriage is associated with anything sexuality or sexual, if you will. What we mean by that is sexual intimacy, whether quite literal, or something as simple as hand holding, kissing, or something like that, before marriage is viewed as inherently bad. There's not, it's almost viewed as, if not essentially, is viewed as a sin. They are not allowed to engage in any sexual intimacy before marriage. As teens, hormones are involved, all of that. And the idea of being in close proximity to the opposite gender is viewed as a huge no-no, a huge danger, kind of because, like what we said previously, men kind of have that impulsivity within them. You know, what happens if he decides to touch you? Oh, well, it's your fault. It's not the men's fault, but it's your fault. So because of that, marriage kind of becomes this forced choice for both the men and the women because, you know, hormones are involved, love is involved. Wanting to touch somebody is inherently viewed as good for them. They want that, but they're not allowed to. So what's the alternative? For some people, it's either we get married so we can have sexual intimacy or we break up. It's for a lot of them, it's forced. So Olivier and Vincent really give off excuse me, good examples, if you will, as well when it comes to marriage. Olivier says, and along with that, they also had this rule which they scared us into that a man and a woman shouldn't be in one place alone with each other, that there's no accountability, and that you'll be led in a way into temptation and all that kind of stuff. That was deeply ingrained in all of us. We all felt a fear of that because we felt that our faith was hanging in the balance. And it would be a mistake that would cause us to shipwreck our faith. Right there, what's the biggest possible sin is this idea that their faith can be destroyed because there's no accountability between a man and a woman if they, heaven forbid, hold hands. Um, it's a very big fear for them that's put on their shoulders from the very beginning. So they are essentially kind of forced. They force their hands, if you will. And Vincent says, I think the youngest girl below me was like 7 years younger, 8 years younger. And of course, you had to marry someone from there. So it was like you were just kind of like, well, this is like an arranged marriage. So we kind of just both grew up being like, so that's who I'm going to marry. So this idea of you're essentially not allowed to even choose who you're going to marry. Like with Vincent's group, you don't have that choice. Now, yes, he kind of doesn't necessarily say arranged marriage. He says it, but he doesn't really want to say it, let's be honest. But at the base of it, you don't have a choice on who you're going to marry, and you're expected to marry in a group. I think we can consider that as an arranged marriage. So, also, it kind of, the marriage also can kind of um, follow them, if you will. What we mean by that is that for some participants, they won't say forced marriage, period. They don't have a tendency to think that. And oftentimes, uh, they're forced into situations. Like Beria says, I met a man in church when I was 17, and by 18, we were married. Then I don't want to say it was a forced marriage, but it was borderline forced. But with Beria, it's very interesting because she was essentially forced with her family. For her, it was either she was going to marry this person or she was expected to get kicked out of the house, if you will. So she didn't, essentially, she did not have any other options. It was a forced marriage. Adele says, when we started high school together when we were 17. So my father wasn't happy because we were too young. You shouldn't get involved with a guy when you're too young. My father stopped us from seeing each other one night. And for her, having that person in her life actually had given her joy, had pretty much given her a chance to be alive again. Um, and interestingly enough, like she says, because we were 17, it was still viewed as bad. And this idea that that's her freedom is essentially being taken away from her yet again. When we talk about sexuality, oftentimes we'll also talk about fear because it kind of stems together. So, what do we mean by that? Well, sexuality sometimes gives way to fear-based control. Sometimes in terms of being in the group, but also in the fear of having to leave or getting kicked out, if you will. So, Bria says, oh, this girl here didn't listen to God. She left the religion. She slept with a man and he gave her HIV. It was all extremes all the time. When you leave the religion, you're going to get beaten up, abused, fall into drugs, get AIDS. So, right there, we see that fear for sexuality isn't just formed in the, oh, you can't touch somebody, but see what happens when you do touch somebody. See what happens when you don't follow what is expected of you in the group or you leave the group. This fear, AIDS is, you know, at the time, I believe it was during the AIDS epidemic, or even so, even if it wasn't, AIDS is often associated with this big fear. And for them, that's the ultimate thing, you know. If you get HIV, you get AIDS, you're going to die. So for them, it's this fear tactic. Nikki says, and then I would rather hang out with the men, but then it was sort of hypersexualized. Like even making eye contact was sexual. This idea that something as simple as eye contact with the opposite sex becomes sexual is something that normal terms and us not being in cults, we wouldn't necessarily see that as that way. But having everything sexual kind of be viewed as a sin, if not for the fact that you're married, everything is a sin. Something as simple as making eye contact with the opposite sex is viewed completely as sexual, and you can be viewed as that person who, you know, could be also viewed as a predator, if you will, because you're looking at somebody too long and for what they're going to define that as being too sexual. No, but it's a tactic that they do use. Okay, I can go. I was making sure. So, what we wanted to do, like we mentioned at the very top of the presentation, was kind of identify this continuum of violence that's experienced in the group, especially when it comes towards women and girls. And, you know, we didn't necessarily give all the examples because we be here for like 3 days, let's be honest. We have there's plenty of information to give. But regardless, what happens in terms of violence against women, there is a reason for that. So it's to ensure that compliance towards women. It's this idea, again, it's this idea of making the person submit. What's the biggest importance for them? The woman submits, the man is assertive. To also to punish the deviance. Oh, did you wear a shorter skirt than you were allowed to? Oh no, that won't do. You get punished for that because you're straying away from the norm, what's acceptable. To be able to control women's bodies at all times, not just the reproductive organs, the whole bodies as a whole. And essentially because men can. Like we mentioned earlier, that is an inherent component, a very important part that we saw in all the definitions, a lot of the participants. It's because men can and women don't have control of their own bodies, essentially. So that's why different forms of violence tended to show up for participants. So whether that's comments that, and bring up humiliating feelings for the woman, if you will, physical violence, harassment, this idea of forced marriage, sexual violence, whether it's incest or having been sexually assaulted within, couple context or by the leader, or even sexual coercion. It's all, situations of violence that we have noticed, we have seen that people have talked about. And it's not necessarily just one thing that happens within the participants. So, for example, Daphne says the man has authority over his family. So it's like spousal abuse, but it's not encouraged, but it's very tolerated. So, again, this idea that to be able to make sure the woman obeys, he has to have authority. What's the biggest, easiest, quote unquote, way to put that authority on is through spousal abuse or family abuse. And a lot of times it is physical violence, but we're not necessarily denying that verbal and other kinds aren't also as very prevalent, It's still important to say. And that's what it then says. My mother, I never saw her with bruises or broken hands, but mentally she was beaten. And that's the point of saying it's not just one situation, one time. There is a continuum to it. When it comes to members of the 2S LGBTQIA community, they also face different types of violence, if you will. Especially when it comes to gender specifically, they have a lot of experience when it comes to not following that naturalizing definition of gender, which we talked about earlier. So they have this constant pressure towards gender conversion. They don't necessarily have to have a gender program, if you will, conversion therapy program. Sometimes that's kind of very subtle. That can be done by members kind of, saying things, or sometimes it's also as simple as that kind of gets internalized. Uh, but the main goal, the main reason, if you will, for that violence is so that they comply with the binary standard. You are a man if you were born a man. You're a woman because you were born a woman. So violence can happen with psychological violence, homophobia or transphobia, internalized homophobia. We have seen that silence in terms of saying what happened to their experience or not, or keeping it to themselves. Imposition of gender activities, forced marriage again, sexual assault. So, as two examples, we have Adele here who says, "I knew I was gay when I was young, and I didn't want to get married either, but I wasn't allowed to be gay because I had to get married. When I was young, I was more attracted to girls. I liked being with boys, but it was considered bad in the group, so I kept to myself. So my former partner, as I loved him just the same, as I had children with him, but I still knew I wasn't attracted to men." So right there, you see that she identifies as a lesbian at a very young age. But for her, at the end of the day, she knows she can't get married to who she wants to get married to because she's gay. But she does get married, but that idea is that, yeah, I married him and yeah, I loved him and I had children with him, but I wasn't necessarily attracted to him. Says a lot. And Nikki says, I was called out in a meeting as an example of someone who had become straight. They were intentionally breaking down my LGBTQ identity. She also says, I'm holding on to this hope uh, that deep down they still accept me, or that maybe I have turned straight. Excuse me. And Nikki was also a victim during not during, but I don't really want to get into it, but just keep that in mind with the next little quote. Maybe I was attacked because I'm different. And if I can like really assimilate with like heteronormative culture, then maybe like I'll actually be safer and happier, like they're telling me that I will. So imagine somebody who identifies themselves at the time, I believe they identify themselves as bisexual, um, and they're not allowed to identify themselves as such in the group because it's viewed as inherently bad.
Those two quotes are extremely violent
Yes.
toward those women, those persons, but they don't they don't describe it as such. Even Nikki, she
No.
say that, oh, maybe if I change, that will be better.
Yes.
Those quotes are terrible in terms of violence, and it's a kind of violence that is experienced on an everyday basis. So that's rough to read.
Yes. Absolutely.
Who use violence? So usually it's men. So husband, father, men within the community, authority figure. The role of women in those cases is that they have to be witness to that violence. They are forced to do nothing, to only observe. So they cannot protect their children. They cannot protect other members. They only have to respect the violence used by other men.
Mhm.
What is the consequence to that? Often when the woman will quit the community, they will feel a lot of guilt about their inaction within the group. And
Yeah.
often men who use violence within the group will say, I shouldn't have done that. They will feel guilt because they were pressured to use that to conform to conform others to the norm. If we listen to Brielle and Adels once again, they talk about that subject. If I behave in a rebellious way, then the man in authority will tell me, we just wanted to tell you that your skirt was a little too short today. You're going to trip the men. If the men in the group look at you and then they think your skirt is too short and they start having sexual idea about you, it's your fault. It's the fault of the woman who wore the dress too short. The speech was really, really present. So here we see that even if it's the man who touched the woman
Mhm.
who has a shorter dress, it's the women who are responsibilized for their behavior.
Absolutely.
Then all of a sudden, my parents were working, and I heard two gentlemen, two members of the group, banging on the door and saying, Adele, can we talk to you a minute? And I was like, my parents aren't here. They were like, it won't take long. They started talking to me about my boyfriend, asking me personal questions as if we were touching. Do you believe that two older men who come to your house and ask you questions about your sexuality, even when your parents aren't present? Though this is a violence.
Absolutely.
Uh, we will listen now to Camille, who, as you know, is a survivor of incest. When my father was with the police, he bawled, I took him in my arm, but I say, I forgive you. But the rest I didn't say. I haven't forgotten the assault. I saw him bawling, and then everyone was bawling. Then I went to see him, took him in my arm. I forgave you, but in the end, it wasn't for forgiveness for real. But I don't know why I did it. You asked me today. I don't know. To make me feel better? No, I have no idea. it's almost as if she has to tell him that she forgave him.
Yeah.
She is the victim, but it's almost as if she is the aggressor, of almost as if she is responsible for that behavior. She doesn't know why she act like this, but we have the concept of empathy that can help us to understand what she is experiencing.
100%.
Empathy is the sympathy that we have for an aggressor and the reaction that we have toward a victim or a survivor. Mostly, we will responsibilize the victim and we will excuse the aggressor. And what we see here is it's exactly that. Her father committed sexual violence toward her. He is at the police station to be arrested, and she asked him forgiveness.
Yeah.
And nobody stopped her.
Yeah. Strong.
Strong, yeah, for sure. My father told me that, yes, he was like that by nature, but it was because I had provoked him in this rage against myself, because I was standing up to the leader. Huh? So she is responsible of the violence of her father because she didn't respect the role model. She asked questions to the leader, so that was not allowed.
Yeah.
So she has to accept the consequences. That, in a way, normalize and minimize violence experienced by women in cultic organization.
Absolutely. So, what were the effects, if you will, on gendered violence with the participants we met? So, these effects kind of did not only stem from their time during the group, but it also followed them afterwards. And we think it's kind of important still to go through them. So, there was this constant fear, this constant feeling of fear, if you will. So, like we mentioned earlier, fear-based tactics was something very common and it followed them. We saw that with Brielle earlier with her example with HIV and AIDS. This big example of, oh my God, if you do this, this fear will be, you know, overwhelming, if you will. There's a feeling of guilt that was also very common. You know, all this time during the group, you're told that you can't do this before you're married and so and so. So imagine if you suddenly start holding hands with somebody and you're not married, but you're out of the group. That sense of guilt is still within you. It doesn't necessarily turn on and off like light switch, you know? Experiencing secrecy, there's this idea also that for some people in the group, when they are in the group, they do they actually still do these things despite this fear, this feeling of fear. They do this on secrecy, you know, even their idea of what they identify as a gender or their sexuality can be felt in secrecy. It still eats at them no matter what. And some of them do uh, you know, try things no matter what, if it's in secrecy during their times in the group. There's also this side of anxiety, if you will, of either if they do experience or if they don't experience or if they have, you know, tempting thoughts, if you will, towards such a thing, that anxiety can continually uh, live within them. There's this normalization of violence. When we think of physical violence, there's also this association of, you know, um, either, oh, you didn't hit me hard, or it doesn't really count. It's not really, you know, it's not really physical violence because so and so did this, or oh, you know, I said yes even though I didn't really mean it, but I said yes, so it still counts. So for them, it's not necessarily they view that as violence, or they don't view that at all, and that's kind of why normalization and invisibility of violence kind of have a tendency to go hand in hand, because for certain people, they don't even necessarily associate that type of violence with it being violent. You know, we talked about Adele and Brienne and all that earlier. Adele not recognizing that she was essentially forced into a marriage with a man, even though she's gay, is viewed as invisibility. She doesn't necessarily associate that as violence. And for some of our participants, while they were able to explain situations where something like that happened, they didn't necessarily associate it towards violence, like exactly. Um, there's also depression and suicidal thoughts that were sometimes viewed within during their times in the group and even afterwards. And some of them had difficulties at integrating outside of the group. So, what do we mean by that? Well, for some people, because they were so strained during the group, so they didn't necessarily, get to date, get to flirt, or something like that in their teens. For some people, they really had a hard time when it came to being out of the group. They would associate that to being like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't get a chance to do that when I was a teenager. And for certain people, they would leave the group and say, oh, for the next 3 or 4 years, I'm going to live like when I was a teenager because I didn't get a chance to.
Mm.
So, what was an example of, the effects that it had? Well, Brienne would say, I was always expecting big problems. I was afraid of dating. I was afraid of sleeping with men. I was afraid of everything. So, yes, the examples of HIV/AIDS is an example based on, relationships and intimacy and sexual intimacy, but it doesn't necessarily, the fear doesn't stop at anything sexual or relationships. It builds and builds and builds, and it builds once you leave the group. So it's not just, I'm not fearful of getting a job, I'm also fearful of everything else.
For sure. So what can we conclude or see as present in every participant discourse? Every man recognized that they had the ability to control women. In fact, it was something expected to them. So even the leader asked them to do it. They had to make that the women who live with them will obey them. If not, they were seen as such of a good man if they didn't do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Men, and inversely, men feel they cannot control their sexual urges and violence. So it's contrary, but it was present in each participant. They
Absolutely.
saw that themselves that they couldn't control their desire for other women. So we had to protect them during their teenage year so they wouldn't be exposed to a spaghetti strap.
Yeah.
Women must reinforce that they must use their gender role, they must become women. So, in a way, because it's repeated at school, within the group, they will develop an hyper-vigilance of Céleste.
It's okay. It's hyper vigilance. I understand. I do the
Thank
same
you
thing.
for that. To ensure the respect of the norm. So they will always look at their behavior to be sure that they will respect each of the norms imposed within the group.
Yeah.
So they will feel stress over time to be always looking, oh, am I okay? Am I okay?
Yes.
It will, and at the end, they will feel fear and guilt constantly.
Yes.
What was the impact of all of that? Gender preparation for adulthood. Since they were youngsters, they've started to practice the gender roles.
Mhm.
Women will we will look at them as uh, um, people who can look after the children as young as 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. They will have to learn to cook as young. So they will have to show that they are learning their future role of homemaker.
Yes.
And the male will be we will look at them as practicing their ability to bring money home. So they will work with their father.
Yeah.
They will repair car or work on thing, repair something in the house.
Yeah.
What will it do? It can put in the short, medium, or long term, when the person quit the group, it can place them in a position of vulnerability.
Yes.
Why? Because they haven't learned to get a job, to how to, for example, use money for the moment, for example. So often they have to get a GED to get an apartment. So that will put on them a lot of stress
Yes.
and a lot of difficulty to integrate outside the community. People from the two SGBTI community will also experience a lot of violence within the group. Even if they didn't experience conversion camp or conversion therapy, the pressure that they will experience in their everyday life will have consequences on their identity long after they quit the group.
Absolutely.
For some, that will be self-hatred or psychological vulnerability. And at the end, most of the former members that we met had difficulty to identify the violence that they experienced within the Cultic group. Yeah. So we have to understand how the violence is become invisible within the group to understand the experience. And we have to help them, if they want, how to recognize the violence that they experience to give them their power back. In conclusion, go ahead, Celeste, go ahead.
Whatever you want, whatever you want.
Go ahead.
Okay. So what does that all mean? What do we want what do we want to come out of this? Really, we would like there to be more support towards deconstructing gender socialization, especially once they've learned that within their groups. Like we talked about earlier, there's this idea that once you leave the group, everything kind of stops. But the reality is that it doesn't. And it doesn't just turn off. It doesn't just stop because you're in the quote unquote real world now. Those individuals that we met and many former members have a tendency to have struggles when it comes to deconstructing those gender socializations. So if somebody does prefer to go towards a male-oriented job, they might have that fear. They might have this confusion, even despite the fact that they're not in the group. So if we can learn to support those people or how to support them, that already is a very big step. We also would like there to be more economic and psychological support within leaving the group. That was also something that was mentioned quite a few times within the participants, especially that support is easily accessible. It's one thing to have it, but it's another thing towards accessibility, which is kind of key for many people, because once they leave, for a lot of them, they don't necessarily know where to turn to, even if those supports may exist. So if there is a way to make that accessible for them, that would be very much ideal. And training for professionals. So not only does that benefit the professionals in terms of, having to know what to do, when to do it with who, but it also just benefits the former members, because for some people we did learn that while they were looking for help, they weren't necessarily able to get those needs fulfilled from a professional, because that professional did not have the education or the training needed to really assess and work with the person who had, very important and different or unique goals and needs, if you will, that a former member does have. So hopefully, this can kind of start or continue the ball rolling, and that's the goal.
So we will join you for answer some of your questions. But if you want to write to us to ask other questions, don't hesitate. This is our email address. So we are free. We will answer your question with great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.